Hello, everyone, and welcome to What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Margaret.
And this is Amy, and today we're talking about mom guilt and getting rid of it.
Mom guilt.
If that's possible. It's hard to believe we haven't talked about this already in the hundreds of episodes we've done, but we have. I mean, it's certainly been a through line, as we say in the biz, but not a specific episode.
Yeah. I'm in the throes of some mom guilt right now. I'm a little bit overbooked right now. And I am truly going a couple of days a week where I don't see my kids from sunup to sundown. I more have wife guilt. I mean, I think that my kids are fine, but I definitely feel that my husband is operating on 25 different cylinders. And I feel a little bit guilty about this.
Kind of like household guilt.
Yeah, I'm just kind of not pulling my weight around the homestead these days, but it's a season. I feel my sister always says when people say things about themselves, you should believe the opposite. So I'm always wary to make I statements, but I'm going to lean in early. I don't think I have a tremendous amount of mom guilt. I don't think this affects me that strongly.
Well, that's interesting because it's sort of like broadly understood to be an absolutely inescapable part of motherhood. So we can talk about why that is, if that is. But it doesn't surprise me that you're like, not so much. I mean, that's sort of your, entry point.
I definitely don't. I just think I need a little bit more mom guilt. I'm like, they're fine. They were only on screens for 8 hours today. It's fine. I mean, I have stuff that tugs at me, but I definitely don't feel a tremendous. My kids are like, you're leaving again tonight? And I'm like, yeah, I got a job. I got somewhere to be. Goodbye. Like, I definitely don't feel that thing of like, I have had girlfriends when we went away or had whatever, my bachelorette back in the day, whatever it was, friends who were like, oh, it was so hard leaving my kids. And my best friend would always be like, I just don't understand when people talk about that. Like, I do not. And now that I have kids of my own, I'm from that school. Like, people who are like, oh, I had to go away from my kids for 2 days. I have a friend in town who is wired totally that way. And she was saying to me, wait until the 8th grade trip. It's going to be so hard. And I said, it's hard. Like it's a lot of paperwork to get ready for. Like, what does it mean that the 8th grade trip is so hard?
Packing needs?
Right. Like I don't get what's hard about it. Like you have to lift them onto the bus. I don't understand. Like where would the hardness come in?
Snack preparation.
And she was saying, oh, it's just, you watch that bus pull away and it tugs at the heart. I'm like, I do not have that lane in my brain. Whatever
Turn
the
off.
like.
You're like,
yeah, I'm dead inside, Amy. But maybe, man, it's got some downsides, but it makes for some very easy saying goodbye to my kids.
I think mom guilt. As I did the research for this episode, I realized that when people are talking about mom guilt, it's one of those things like everybody knows what it is when you say it, but it also kind of means whatever people want it to mean.
Sure.
So I would argue, as we begin our conversation, that when people are talking about mom guilt, they're talking about two very different sort of things.
All right, lay them on,
talk about each, but I thought it was important. So the first one is the ongoing low-grade inadequacy concerns, like my soccer sideline snacks don't look like their soccer sideline snacks. That's mom guilt.
Yes.
Universal, low-grade, part of the job description or not maybe, but like, oh, well, like stop feeling that way all the time.
I'm not doing a good job as a mom.
I'm not doing a good job as a mom. I should be doing more. I should be doing different. I should be doing it like her. I should be doing it like this momfluencer, whatever. So that's the first kind. And I think that's worth looking at because I think it grinds our gears. I think it like gets in the way. I think it weighs us down in ways that it shouldn't and needn't. But then there's this whole other thing as I started doing the research about like, say, like you turn your back and the baby rolled off the changing table. As happened to me, happened to you. Like
smacked their head so hard on the way down on the end table.
Right. Or like the bed or, whatever. Right. That feeling when like something or like a child gets burned, the guilt that you feel when you can't get over that something happened to your kid, even though they're fine.
I'm making a cringe face. Or you told them to stop complaining about their stomach ache for 2 days and it turned out to be their appendix.
Yes. So you do have mom guilt.
I mean,
we found it. Yeah. Yeah. So like you don't walk
It
around.
happens. The kid didn't die. He survived.
But at the time, you were like, "Oh my god!" You know, like
Yeah.
I mean, I remember we talked about it. Like,
Yeah, I was like, Mom fail.
I am the worst. How did I miss this? And like literally everybody would miss that. It's fine.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Sidebar on that, I do want to say, my son, who's a teenager, is he's volunteering at a grade school right now, and he came home and told me that a kid had his appendix burst. I said, at school? And he said, no, later. And he came back to school and said the reason his appendix burst was that he ate too many Takis. At which point I burst out laughing. You know what Takis are? They're like
spicy chips for sure. We love a Taki.
No, they're not a sponsor.
Come on aboard, Taki. We love you. We love a spicy chip.
I burst out laughing, and he was like, Mom, it's not funny. His appendix burst. I'm like, his appendix burst because he ate too much of a snack food? He's like, it's a thing. And I was like, that's definitely...
No, it's not a
if
thing.
If it made your appendix burst, I think it wouldn't be on the market. But then, of course, I had to go look it up on the internet. No, it gives you a stomach ache if you eat too many extremely spicy things.
Well, now... what could have happened is that he thought he had a stomach ache because of the Takis, so he ignored it, and therefore his appendix burst because he was blaming the Takis for the pain that was actually caused by the appendix.
Right.
So the Takis were involved.
Right. But
now we've lost our Takis. Now we've lost our Takis sponsorship.
Right. Right. We're losing. No, I'm defending them. That's not.
We're Team Taki people.
But even like, I don't know, a kid who's, taking the more serious mom guilt, like the kid who's born with a developmental delay, and you're like, oh my God, I had that glass of wine, before I knew I was pregnant. I'm a bad mother. I think that sort of mom guilt that people carry around with them.
For sure.
My baby's 2 weeks old, and I'm not loving every moment of this because maybe I'm a little bit depressed. Mom guilt. Yeah, like those are sort of big and more problematic for the person suffering from it, for the mother, and more important, I guess.
Yep.
But they're both called mom guilt, and that's sort of I think that's an overly broad definition. Therefore.
So the two categories are: I'm not doing it well enough in comparison to other moms, and something bad happened to my kid and I feel bad about it, or my kids are just generally not doing what everyone else is doing.
Like little things mom guilt and big things mom guilt. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
Right? And they're both I think they're both things that we like. Are they avoidable? Probably not. Should we try to push back on it and reframe them? I think yes. I think the answer is yes.
For sure.
All right. So let's start with low grade mom guilt.
Okay.
That's maybe easier. So I'm quoting psychologist Lisa Marie Emerson here, who said women are especially good at taking credit for everything that's wrong in their kids' lives. Sort of like, bump, like, stop doing that, women.
Yeah, but I do think this is a circle that we don't always see both sides of.
Yes.
So when I was working at my first job, I worked with a guy named Vinny. And Vinny was full of good aphorisms, and he was like a hilarious. He was not that much older than me, but he was like, here's the thing, kid. And he was always telling me about. But one of the pieces of advice that he gave me that has stuck with me, and I think of it all the time, is at some point I was working as a paralegal, and some lawyer was like, you did a great job making those copies. And I came back all shiny gold star, he said I did a great job. And Vinny was like, listen. If you take their praise, you have to take their criticism. So don't take either. And I was like, I think that is, we don't always see the part where basking in the praise has a flip side. And I do think that feeling this feeling of my kid doing the solo in the play and the accolades I get for that
reflects on me, right?
That I am basking in that warmth,
right?
But then I'm opening myself up to the cold of my kid got an F on the test. It must be my fault. I think that we are a little bit over involved generally with our relationship with our kids. I find that to be true.
All right. I have a different thought on this. I have total pushback on this idea because I've been thinking about this a lot recently. The idea about women take credit for everything that's wrong in their kids' lives. So stop doing that. Kooky women, just stop being like that all the time. It's well, why do you think that we feel the pressure to make everything right? Because when something goes wrong, who is looked to blame? when the kid
Right.
doesn't have their cleats, when the kid is late every day, when the kid is, not speaking in 2-word sentences by 24 months or whatever, right? It's like society looks at us and we feel bad when we're assume that we've done something wrong to make this something wrong in this kid's lives, but we're not imagining that. Like, that's very much the way society is constructed.
Agree. We're not imagining it at all.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue that there's two sides of it, and I think both are harmful. I just was reading a book that I enjoyed that I won't mention because I'm going to criticize the author. But it was this portrait of a life and this unbelievable closeness with her children. Like this unbelievable admiration of like the way my children's minds work is just a magical world. And
Right.
kind of like my kids are my best friends, and that they have this relationship that is so close that I look at that and I just think my parents did not have that relationship with their children at all. My parents were great parents, I think, but we weren't besties, I mean, there was no element of that. And I think that it helped them divorce a little bit from the idea of like, also when we did something good, certainly they were happy, but I don't think it was as presentational, the whole thing of like, me and my little bestie are reading. Look at this poem she wrote. She's such a genius. I don't know. It seems like there's too much buy-in on both sides of the scale. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess it does. Like I'm thinking on Dance Moms when, like, I don't know, Savannah gets the solo, right? And Savannah's mom's on the bleachers, like flipping her hair because it's really her that got the solo. You're saying if you buy in too much to every little thing your kid does or says reflects on you positively.
And I don't mean this. Listen, this is also societal, but I do think there's a little, like, I feel like my mom dropped me at the front door of gymnastics and then picked me up later. And I'd be like, I landed on the beam. And it would be like, okay, great. Now we're having hot dogs for dinner after we pick up your brother. Like, I do think that we are in a parenting thing where like the expectations of how close we're going to be with our kids and how magical our relationship with our kids is going to be has a very dark flip side. And I think it comes, now I'm going to go rogue. I think it comes from like anti-feminism, like women going back to work and like this whole portrait of like moms are not just there to like feed the kids, get them out the door, and then get on with their day. Moms are there to be like the sun and the moon, and like we're supposed to be sitting around having long conversations. Like, I don't want that relationship with my children, and I think that some of the ways that I am a little bit freer than some people I know from some of the guilt is that I'm also not like, oh my God, my kid is my best friend. Let me read you their poem because their mind is such a beautiful space.
I mean, it goes without saying, I suppose, right? Just to back up what you're saying about this being tied up with feminism, that there's like dad guilt is not a thing. Like dad guilt isn't something that has a name that's presumed to be a completely unavoidable and everyday part of their experience, that they're constantly like, but am I really there? And am I doing enough? And did their bento box lunch look like Julia's bento box lunch or whatever? It's not a part of your spouse who's taking on like the lion's share of the household stuff right now during this season to support this thing in your career for this moment. I hope he's not like his head isn't hitting the pillow at night and he'd be like, oh, they didn't finish their green beans. Like I don't think that's
literally never.
Yeah,
and we are also, I mean, I just had a thing where, it was the scout swim test and make sure they have their bathing suit and their goggles on Friday. No problem. I've got it. No problem. Of course, I'm the mom driving down the street. Like, I forgot the goggles, forgot the stuff. I'll run home. I'm late. I'm going to make everyone else late. Like, I'm kind of the nightmare mom right now, but I do feel very free from the I'm like, it's a season. I'm having a bad season.
Okay. All right. Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to move on to the part that can get a little more serious, like the mom guilt when things get a little more difficult.
For sure.
And why that is even more obstructive.
Yep.
We'll be right back. Okay, so there was a study of the parents of adolescents who were going through mental health struggles, which, welcome to the club. There's a lot of those people in today's society. And the reasons that they felt blame, the parents. And the reasons were that they were bad parents, that they hadn't seen it or caught it sooner or done more,
right?
That they had somehow passed on bad genes and made this happen,
right?
Or that they had created this like family environment from the beginning that had made these things happen.
And not for nothing.
Yeah.
This is not coming from, again, this is not just like, oh, if only you could be relaxed and be cool. Like, this is coming from, like, autism was considered the result of refrigerator moms, which was like cold and unloving moms caused children with autism.
Yeah.
Right? Like, neglectful moms cause kids to be drug addicts. Like, this is not
permissive
just
moms
something...
cause kids to be impulsive, right? And
that's right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is definitely something that, I mean, you hear and see all the time when something happens. You know, I live in a kind of a small town. Something happens in town. Oh, well, they must not be getting something at home because they did this thing. It's like, kids also do stupid things. All kids do stupid things.
Right. Right. And the idea that, I mean, particularly in the case of a kid who's struggling with mental illness, that it's because you're a bad parent or like you didn't have family dinner enough times. And we can stand outside that and be like, that's not why. That's not why, right? Like depression is chemical. But when you're the one whose kid's going through it, most parents report feeling self-blame on one or all of those categories. Like it must have been something I did or didn't do that's making my kid struggle.
For sure. For sure. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Even kids who are, I mean, there's a lot of magical thinking that goes on around kids. And I was just looking at something that was a book that gets sent home from kids with the hospital. And we talked to somebody about this, that like part of like having a sibling in the hospital is they send home like literature and books that are tell the other kids in the family, like, you didn't do anything to cause this, even like a brain tumor or something, you know?
It was our guest who was on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yes. It was Susan Lynn.
Yes. Who was a Fresh Take guest of ours. I'll put the link in the show notes.
But talking about this idea that like she would work with puppets, she would bring puppets into children's hospitals. And I just saw it referenced somewhere else that the idea that you think that like a sibling would think, well, my sibling has a brain tumor because I yelled at her last week. And I think that kind of thinking seems kind of comical, but we just have such a tendency to see the world as a place that we create and that we have a role in everything that happens. And that's just fundamentally pretty misguided. It's actually not the way the world works.
I think you were so dead on saying this. So Dana Dorfman, who is another guest we've had on this show.
Yes.
She wrote about mom guilt. I'll put the link in the show notes for the article. But she said that mom guilt is magical thinking. And similarly, she says mom guilt is a result of magical thinking in your primitive brain.
Mm-hmm.
And she said we become like a child who feels responsible for his parents' divorce. So same kind of thing.
Right.
And the reason why, she says, is because your brain thinks that if you can be at fault, i.e. in charge of what's going wrong for your kids,
in control.
Then you're in control. Then you can also be in control of making it right. You can fix it. The migraine headaches, the seizures, things that are not in your control. Well, if I can just figure out what I did wrong, then I'll be able to fix that and then it'll go away.
No, I mean, and it's funny because while I talk about not having a ton of mom guilt, I do have a ton of OCD behaviors. And I mean, I laugh at like, oh, mom guilt, let it go. But I am a person who is like, we have to eat the cupcakes in this order so the Giants win the Super Bowl. And I'm convinced that like I won the Super. Like, why didn't they send me a trophy to my house when I only ate the cupcakes with the opposing team's logos on them while we were like, there's a way to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's right. This illusion of control that in fact, what's difficult, and I think that's also a reason why when we see other people's kids, oh, I saw those kids drinking in the park. Well, the mom isn't doing it. It's illusion of control, right? That
Yes.
like I have good kids because I control my kids. They have bad kids because they don't control their kids. Therefore, I will never have bad kids because I am in control.
And then you do have bad kids, and that's where the mom guilt comes in.
Yeah, and that's right. I still think that like this is another thing that buying into the judgment, I think the gossiping about other people's kids and the really over buy-in, especially in a small town, the over buy-in to like, let's all pick apart what other people are doing is really dangerous behavior because it ratchets up the pressure of this illusion of control.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like I found that I remember having a revelation about this when I was young and doing comedy. A lot of my time was spent goofing on other people, like just walking through the world and being like, did you see that way that person was walking? Look at that hairdo. Like that just in a group of like funny people that I was in, what we would call like dining out on other people was my major pastime. Just basically being like, oh my God, Amy, did you hear her?
Right.
It's like I spent so much of my time just feasting on the bones of others. And I found that my self-esteem and my self-confidence was very, very low. And I made the connection that like, because I spend all my time thinking and about other people and picking them apart, I see a world in which that's how people behave. And I always assume that wherever I go, people are doing that to me. Spoiler alert. They're not. This comes to the greatest advice I've ever gotten, which I've said many times. My ex-boyfriend said to me at some point, 10 years into this operational system of me, like being the comic who always could see what everyone else was doing wrong and constantly being like, did you see how she was looking at me? She was thinking this, she was thinking that. And my ex-boyfriend said to me, I could picture the room we were standing in because it was that big of a revelation. Your life would change so much if you could realize how rarely anyone else ever thought about you. And it really was like, oh my God, I'm living this whole life where I'm just looking at everyone to pick them apart and assuming that everyone is doing the same. And it's a very fraught way to live. I think if you can let go a little bit of the picking on other people, it frees your mind to be like, it doesn't matter what other people think of me either.
Although you were just saying if you live in a small town, people do like talk about other people. Like you're not totally imagining that that's happening.
Totally not imagining it, but I do
maybe not as much
think
as you think.
Distancing yourself from it a little bit, like it only works if you care. And it's hard to say you don't care. Like obviously if I know people are laughing about me and talking badly about me, it bothers me and I don't like it. And people do talk badly about me, I'm sure. But if I'm not participating in either side of it, I feel a lot less pressure. If I'm not in the mix, if I'm not at cocktail parties being like, did you see their house? Oh my God, the shingles are falling. Like, if I'm not participating in the side that I'm feeding myself with it, I am much less prone to worrying about what other people are saying about me.
That makes sense.
I think I've really freed myself from this to some degree.
Well, let's talk about some of the other problems that can result from mom guilt. Because there are some. I mean, besides like who wants to live this way, right? Like that's enough reason to change it. But there are other ones too, right? So there was a study that looked at moms who were dealing with a couple of different things that they were feeling guilty about. A kid's brain injury, like, okay, that may or may not, maybe the kid fell off a trampoline and maybe they had a brain tumor. Like it has nothing to do with the parent directly.
Or maybe you dropped them.
Or
like,
maybe you dropped them.
That's the thing.
Right.
Like maybe the thing that all of us have done 20 times turned out terribly for you.
Right. And can you imagine being that parent? And the third example was that, and it was adolescents' mental illness. And the third one was like, oh yeah, this one, nursing difficulties. The guilt that mothers feel, and I would argue are made to feel, for not being able to breastfeed effectively or enough, or the kid isn't thriving, or the kid's refusing, or all that stuff, and how overwhelming it is for a new mother. There's so much guilt around that mothers in each of those situations who were feeling extreme guilt around those situations it was hampering their ability to parent effectively.
For sure.
Because of course
it reminds me of the serenity prayer. Like, grant me the wisdom to like change the things I can.
It's Lord, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
It's so much of what we're talking about is foundationally that. It's the misperception of what you can and can't control. And I think that this is something that I had terrible OCD and anxiety as a person in my 20s and thought a lot about control and not control. And then I didn't have kids until I was 37. And I definitely remember talking to moms in my birthing class about their birth plan and like, oh, but my birth plan is this and I'm going to that. And I'm like, why are you making a birth plan? Like, isn't a birth like 90% things you have no control over, And then talking to people afterwards, the birth plan didn't go as planned. And I have this disappointment around it. And just thinking like, I understand where the anxiety comes from, but I do think that the wisdom to know the difference between things we can and cannot control is central to what we're talking about. Do you think so?
I do. I actually have a whole like essay in my book about my birth plan and how it got in the way, that there was any moment when I was holding my new baby, when of course my first birth went nothing like our birth plan, that I was holding my baby and had even that 1% of like, I got the epidural, I caved. That was such a preposterous thing to put on myself in that moment. And I wish that I hadn't done it. Yeah,
I think that's right. It's like my friend's mom has the expression, don't borrow trouble. And it's like we borrow so much trouble with that stuff, which is like, even in a small, funny way of like, we were talking about vacations, right? The vacation is going to look exactly like this. And my sister's planning a trip with one of my kids. And we keep talking about like, you can plan for lots of stuff, but your expectation has to be that only 10% of that stuff is going to actually happen because you're traveling with a 12-year-old, And so it's trying to identify the things that you have control over and figure that out. It's like I always say, my mom always says, like, you can only deal with behavior. You can't deal with like, you're this type of a person. Like, it's like a young person's argument to be like, Amy, you're just the wrong kind of person and I'm going to help you fix yourself. It's like, Amy, I am going to leave if you're more than 10 minutes late, whatever. Like you can only address, which by the way, total reverse problem there. But you know what I mean? Like you can only deal with behavior. I think with mom guilt, it's like you can only deal with what's real somehow. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Like,
yes.
You can't borrow. You got to stop trying to borrow the guilt of like, I want my out of control situation to be completely under control.
It's what Carla Naumburg said is the second arrow of suffering. Remember that when we had her on the show?
Say that again, because that's so good.
I mean, she didn't invent that. It's a Buddhist idea, but that it's the second arrow of suffering, that when, I don't know, like your kid's science project was the worst and he cried because everybody else's was better than his. There's that happened. And then on top of it, you're taking the arrow and like jabbing yourself with it in the side again, like, and also you're a bad mother. Like,
right.
You're bringing it on yourself and giving yourself two things to be upset about when you put the mom guilt on top of the thing that you or your kid might be struggling with.
I think that's right. And I think it's also, it can be a useful thing to model. Like we are preparing for a test right now at our house and it's not going great. And I will say, I am stunned by how hard this test is. And I look at it and it's a test meant for 8th graders. And I know nothing on it. Like, I can't figure it out. I mean, I would get a 20 on this test, maybe out of 100. And we have gotten to a point in doing tutoring and lots of things to try to prepare for this test that it may not go great, you know? And that I am sort of shifting my focus to like, we need to go all in and get a good grade on this test, to we've done the best we can at a certain point, and this test is going to be what it's going to be, you know? Because you can't judge a fish by its ability to ride a bicycle, and you can't judge me and one of my children by our ability to get a good grade on this test, because this is just apparently not how our minds work, you know? Yeah. And I am a functional old lady who does not know any of the things on this test. And I think that recognizing what we do and don't have control over, and then saying to ourselves, I'm going to do the best I can, but I may not be a bento box mom. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do the best I can.
It's separating out on the way in, right? Like, this is, okay, like if my kid fails this math test, I'm making this up, and they have to do some extra math stuff this summer, that might be like a logistical hassle and something I'll needs to give some additional support around. But that will happen, or it won't happen. But the like, oh, idiot, why are you such a bad mother? Why did you not study math more when you were a kid? Whatever you're going to beat yourself up about. Like, that's the optional part, right? And I understand why you're feeling that way, but you need to kind of notice it on the way in. Be more mindful about like, here's what's happening, and here's the thing I'm laying on top of what's happening.
Yeah, and I also think we've talked a lot about like the triangle or the parent compass or the like mom's list of needs, like figuring out what value is the most important. And I think that in looking at this test, we came into it with the value that is most important is getting good grades, right? And like that now, 2 months into preparing for the test, we're realizing that like our true value is like doing our best, and then realizing the context of the thing that maybe is not as important. It's like if you fail because you didn't try, that's very different than if you fail because you tried really, really hard and it didn't work out.
Right.
And I think giving voice to those kind of things for your kids and for yourself is, okay, so we are now in a 3-week period where I am so busy at work that like I'm not making a single meal. Dad doesn't love to cook. You're going to have pizza maybe 3 nights a week. One of my kids just said, like, we're having pizza again? I was like, yes.
You found it. You found the outer edge. I was going to say kids would always want pizza for dinner, but there's some point where he's like,
I have a weird kid who doesn't really like pizza, which is crazy. But
well, maybe that kid will learn to cook.
Yeah, maybe. But I think that it's like, does it pull at me a little bit? Like, I have kids who aren't even getting fed a meal at night. But what I'm doing is a passion of mine, and I want to do it. And it's more important than my kids not having pizza 3 nights. Like I think that maybe what I'm coming to in this conversation is that the more you can have clarity of mind about what's going on, the best defense you have against mom guilt.
Yeah. And again, like I can stand outside this, like you're not saying like, I'm never going to cook for you guys again. And you're out in the backyard, like smoking a cigarette like Betty Draper, right? Like this is like,
I mean, I'm not saying it's never happened, but okay.
A couple of weeks, right? And then it's going to go back to the way things were. And your kids will be so proud of you for this achievement that you do. I mean, I also think it's worthwhile. And sometimes we're too hard on ourselves as mothers, and we forget the part where our kids need to see us achieve things and be proud of us, whether it's running a marathon or starting a business or, just being good at things besides showing up at drop off with the thing they forgot. You know what I mean? It's important for our kids too, but we're still like in a very dated way, I think. I'm quoting Laura Bazelon here. She wrote a book called Ambitious Like a Mother, and talks in the book about how ambition still feels like it's sort of antithetical to good mothering. Mm-hmm. And that we kind of need to get past feeling like we're doing something wrong when we're preoccupied by something other than our kids' gymnastics lessons.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And the idea of what a good parent is, that sometimes it's like we're chasing the wrong, we're like pounding on the good parent door and trying to get in. And like 2 doors down is an open door that's like, all right, parent, but really happy parent, who's doing well and is not stressed out. And yeah, I think sometimes we're chasing like a phantom, a cipher, as you say. Like we're so busy trying to be perfect that we're not like being good, And a lot of that stuff is completely phony. I mean, most of the like, oh my God, are you the most self-actualized mom in the world who has the happiest kids who do all the activities and have all the great Pinterest lunches and handmade cakes? And I don't know. I don't think that's interesting.
Well, if you haven't listened to our Sarah Peterson interview, she wrote Momfluencers. I just interviewed her a week or two ago, and it was like a thunderbolt to me during the show, like, oh, their lives aren't like that either. This is a job for which they work very hard to get that pie crust sitting on the windowsill in the exact dappled sunlight, like that woman, and good for her. She's a content creator who's getting paid, but she spent like 6 hours making that pie crust look like that. Like the rest, like her kids don't eat that every night. Like nobody's like that, not even those people.
Right.
And I hadn't really thought about that before.
Yeah, for sure.
They're working really hard.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it really is that thing of like, is my value being perceived as perfect, or is my value having like a calm and happy home somehow? That there's a disconnect between those two things. And I think that and I'm not somebody, I mean, I definitely right now have a home of total chaos that is driving me crazy because I have not been keeping up with stuff because I've been so busy. And I cannot live in mess. Like when I walk into the kitchen and the sink is full of dishes, it grosses me out on a fundamental level. And so it's not just like, let it go. Don't be so uptight, because we all have lines, and I have my own lines where I'm like, okay, I don't actually want to live like this. It's too gross for me. I don't like the feeling of a messy house, but it's not presentational, I guess. It's got to be kind of like what you want your life to look like.
And I mean, maybe this is hokey, but I think it's true. When you feel the mom guilt, it's because it renders you feeling really isolated, because like I can't say this out loud because nobody else has ever done this thing, ever felt this way, ever been such a horrible person that let their baby fall off the changing table and the pediatrician says they're fine, but you're still thinking about it 6 weeks later, and nobody's ever done that before, right? Literally both of us and 10,000 people listening to this episode, right? It's being that part of the mom guilt is we keep it to ourselves, when if we had just sort of said it out loud, this misgiving that we had, any of our friends, our spouses, our parents, whatever, could probably help us dispel those. Like, you realize that's not anything you did. But when we kind of keep it for ourselves, we can lose perspective.
I always remember this mom from my preschool. She's a friend of mine now, but I didn't know her at the time. And her little 3-year-old was like, Mom, we're late. I was, of course, late, and she was late. And I was like, okay, this is a mom I need to befriend. But my kids, going to class, and her son said, well, Mom, they started, whatever, flag saluting or whatever the heck they do first thing in preschool. And I can't believe I missed it because we're late again. And she just turned to her son. She's from Alabama. And she's like, well, honey, you were born into the wrong family if you wanted to be one of those on-time kids. And I just thought, like, what a good perspective. Like, this can't be fixed. And not like, oh, I'm so sorry, this is terrible. I was like, well, listen, this is the way it is. We're a late family. Sorry. You should have been born into one of the on-time families if you wanted to be here for Flag Day.
I would argue that she can't live in that, like, complete, like, oh, well, I let it roll off my back.
No, I'm sure she doesn't. I'm sure she doesn't. But I think she does for a lot. She has a self-acceptance around, like, we're not the now. Also, I've been to her house. She has beautiful parties with Canada. Maybe she's got a beautiful host.
Right, those are the things she's
not. She's not just totally laid back. But I think the more we can say, like, well, we're not the best. We're not the worst. We're somewhere in the middle, and this is how we roll. It makes it easier for all of us.
Yes. You solved it.
Solved it.
about our mailing list? Let's talk about our mailing list.
Sure.
Have you joined our mailing list? Go to our website, whatfreshhellpodcast.com. There's a link there. I'll also put a link in the show notes for this episode. You can sign up for our mailing list. You get our newsletter once a month, which has some of our favorite episodes, some of the best sponsor codes and deals from the ads this month, things we're reading and watching and listening to. And I don't know, which we promised. Maybe the name of that book that you didn't want to talk about on the show. Will you reveal that in the newsletter?
No, I can't.
All right.
You'll also get occasionally recipes, what Amy and I are reading, little behind the scenes fun facts. There's a lot in the newsletter. And listen, it only comes once a month, so it's not there to bother you.
Yeah. So sign
up.
And with that, we'll talk to you next week.
Talk to you next time. Bye.